Some stories live in plain sight. Others are whispered, buried, or erased, hidden behind closed doors, coded in letters, rewritten by history. This podcast is about those stories, the ones lived in the margins, the lives shaped by secrecy, the identities edited for survival. Queer poets who wrote in fragments, lovers who passed as roommates, public figures who risked everything just to be themselves, or couldn't. This is Unmasked and Unfiltered, where we peel back the layers of identity, history, and myth to find what's been hiding beneath the surface. And today, we begin where so many queer stories begin, in the closet. I'm your host, Katie, and each week we peel back the layers on stories lived in the shadows, raw truths, secret identities, and narratives hiding just beneath the surface. The stories that were whispered instead of written, edited instead of told, are buried entirely until someone decided to go looking for them. From queer trailblazers and infamous spies to masked monsters and coded characters in film and fiction, we explore how secrets shape identity and how revealing them can change everything. Because secrecy isn't just about what's hidden, it's about who gets to be seen and who gets written out of the story entirely. Why do we hide parts of ourselves? Why do secrets protect or destroy? And what happens when the truth doesn't fit the version of the story we've been told? Each episode is a deep dive, blending history, storytelling, and media to uncover the layers beneath the surface and examine the forces that shape them. Join me as we explore the people, moments, and narratives that challenge who we think we are, or who the world expects us to be. Whether it's history, horror, or hidden threads in pop culture, nothing stays hidden here for long. So pull up a chair, take off the mask, and let's get unfiltered. Today we're diving into the idea of secrecy and concealment in queer history, a journey through closeted lives. Not just as a concept, but as something lived, something navigated, endured, and at times survived. From ancient poets like Sappho, whose love was preserved only in fragments of verse, to the coded language of 18th century scholars who buried desire inside philosophy and art, to the fear-driven Lavender Scare of the 1950s, where simply being suspected could cost you your livelihood or your future. Queer identity has often existed just out of sight, hidden behind closed doors, disguised in plain language, or erased entirely. But these stories were never truly gone. They were just waiting to be read differently, waiting to be understood. So why did people hide? What did secrecy protect? And what did it take away? And perhaps more importantly, how does the closet as both a metaphor and a lived reality still shape identity today? Across centuries, the pattern repeats, not just in who people loved, but in how they were forced to hide it, and what it cost them to be seen. The word closet is one we take for granted now, but its metaphorical use is relatively recent. For Hannah Kushnick, the idea of being in the closet or hiding one's sexuality has been used since the late 1960s. To out somebody is to force them out of that space. The metaphor paints the closet as private, enclosed, and non-social, a space where identity is isolated, but also paradoxically protected. As Kushnick writes, it's a place that's difficult, dark, and precarious, yet safer than what lies outside. Being closeted isn't just a label. It can be a strategy for survival, a self-designation, and a lived experience. Because the closet isn't just about hiding. It's about navigating risk. About understanding, often instinctively, what is safe to reveal and what isn't. What can be said out loud, and what has to stay unspoken. And for many people, that calculation isn't occasional. It's constant. Before this metaphor became common, coming out meant something entirely different. As Olivia Waxman notes, the phrase originally referred to a debutante's introduction into society, a formal presentation into visibility. And in elite gay circles before World War II, coming out carried a similar meaning, but within queer community. It meant revealing oneself to other gay people, often at drag balls modeled after these debutante traditions. Not stepping into the public eye, but stepping into recognition, into belonging, into a space where you didn't have to explain yourself, because you were already understood, which is important because it reframes what coming out originally meant. It wasn't about exposure, it was about connection. But that meaning didn't last. After the Great Depression and into the mid-20th century, the walls of the closet grew thicker. George Chauncey describes how the relative openness of the 1920s gave way to increasing criminalization and social purges. Spaces that once allowed for visibility began to disappear, and what had once been community became risk. By the 1950s, that risk was formalized. Senator Joseph McCarthy's rhetoric labeled homosexuals as national security threats, creating a climate where living openly could destroy your career and your life. And this wasn't just social stigma, it became policy, surveillance, investigation, expulsion. What we now refer to as the Lavender Scare, which we'll explore more in depth later, turned secrecy into something enforced, institutional. And suddenly the closet wasn't just a personal choice, it was a requirement. And over time, that kind of pressure doesn't just stay external, it becomes internal. The closet becomes more than a place, it becomes a way of thinking, a way of editing yourself before anyone else has the chance to, anticipating what might be rejected, and removing it before it can be seen. Not just hiding from others, but learning how to hide from yourself. Because when silence becomes habit, it stops feeling like a choice. And while we often think of the closet as something modern, something tied to identity, language, or even activism, the reality is these patterns are much older. Long before there were words to describe identity the way we understand it now, there were still boundaries, still expectations, still consequences for stepping outside of them. And people found ways to exist within those limits. Sometimes through silence, sometimes through coded language, sometimes through art, philosophy, or performance. Not always openly, but never entirely erased. Because even when something couldn't be said directly, it could still be felt. Still written, still hidden in plain sight. And if we look closely, those traces are still there. In fragments, in subtext, in stories that were never meant to survive, but did anyway. Let's start much earlier, in ancient Greece. On the island of Lesbos, the poet Sappho wrote about love, often between women, in language that was intimate, emotional, and, at times, just ambiguous enough to survive. Most of her work only exists in fragments now, pieces of something larger that's been lost to time. But even in those fragments, the feeling is unmistakable. In one line, she writes, "For whenever I look upon you for an instant, I can no longer find a single word." It's immediate, almost breathless. Desire that overwhelms language itself. A moment so intense, it disrupts the ability to speak at all. And then in another fragment, we see something different. Not just longing, but loss. I have not had one word from her. Frankly, I wish I were dead. When she left, she wept a great deal. She said to me, "This parting must be endured, Sappho. I go unwillingly." I said, "Go, and be happy. But remember, you know well, whom you have shackled by love." It reads like a goodbye, like something that couldn't last, or couldn't be lived openly. Something that had to end, even if the feeling didn't. Sappho lived in a society where women's lives were largely separate from men's, and that separation created space for deep emotional and possibly romantic connections between women. Historian Wendy Slatkin notes that Lesbos itself was unusual in its cultural regard for women, which may be part of why Sappho's work survived at all. And her poetry offers something rare, a glimpse into a world shaped by women's relationships with each other, something scholars describe as a world that men never saw. But even here, we see the tension between visibility and erasure, because what survives is only partial. Fragments, lines disconnected from their full context, moments without endings. And over time, even those fragments were questioned. Later interpretations cast doubt on whether Sappho truly loved women at all, despite what her poetry so clearly suggests. Some accounts claim her work was deliberately destroyed by the medieval church. Whether or not that's fully accurate, the pattern is familiar. When something challenges the dominant narrative, it gets rewritten, reframed, or erased. And yet, her influence endured. By the late 6th century BCE, the meaning of the word lesbian itself began to shift, from meaning somebody from Lesbos to meaning a woman who loves women. Even in fragments, even through reinterpretation, even through attempted erasure, the truth had a way of surviving. And maybe that's what makes Sappho's work so powerful. Not just what it tells us about love, but what it reveals about what happens when that love isn't allowed to exist openly. It doesn't disappear, it becomes something else. Something quieter, something partial, but still, undeniably there. Between those fragments of ancient poetry, there are figures who lived somewhere in between. Not fully hidden, not fully seen. A life lived in careful balance, where expression had to exist without ever being named. Johann Winckelmann, often called the father of art history, was born in 18th century Prussia, where sodomy laws were among the harshest in Europe. To live openly wasn't just risky, it was unthinkable, punishable. So instead, he turned inward, into study, into art, into language that could hold meaning without ever stating it directly. In 1755, he moved to Rome under the patronage of Cardinal Albani, entering a world where, among elite circles, desire could exist, but only quietly, carefully, in fragments of behavior, in shared understanding, and what wasn't said out loud. Not freedom, but proximity to it. And in his writing, we start to see that tension. In History of Ancient Art, Winckelmann describes the foundation of beauty as freedom, but he never explains what that freedom means, not explicitly. Instead, it lingers. Something felt, but not named. Something present, but just out of reach. He writes with particular reverence for the male form, once suggesting that those only moved by female beauty lack a true instinct for art, elevating male beauty as the highest ideal. It's not a declaration, but it doesn't have to be, because for someone like Winckelmann, clarity could be dangerous. To name desire outright would be to expose it, and exposure had consequences. So instead, it's translated into aesthetics, into philosophy, into admiration that can be read one way or another. Because sometimes the safest way to express desire is to embed it in something else entirely, to let it exist without ever being claimed. For Winckelmann, the closet wasn't just a single space. It wasn't a door you stepped in or out of. It was something more subtle, more constant, a way of speaking without saying, a way of revealing without being seen, a language. By the time we reach Victorian England, secrecy wasn't just social, it was dangerous, legally dangerous, publicly dangerous. A risk that could follow you into every part of your life. Oscar Wilde's relationship with Lord Alfred Douglas began in 1891, and from the start, it drew concern from those around them. Friends and family urged distance, not just because of scandal, but because of the very real legal consequences. Because by this point, the line between private life and public punishment was thin, and easily crossed. Those risks became reality when Douglas's father publicly accused Wilde of engaging in what he called improper acts. Wilde responded by suing him for libel, a decision that would ultimately unravel everything, because in order to defend himself, Wilde had to expose the details of his private life. And once those details were spoken aloud, they could no longer be contained. What had once been private became evidence. The case collapsed, a warrant was issued, and Wilde was arrested and sentenced to 2 years of hard labor for gross indecency. During the trial, a phrase emerged that would echo far beyond that courtroom, taken from a poem Douglas had written for Wilde. The love that dare not speak its name. A love that existed, but could not be acknowledged without consequence, because to name it was to risk everything. And once it had been named, there was no taking it back. But even in prison, Wilde's story wasn't his own to control. While incarcerated, he learned that Douglas planned to publish his private letters, without his permission, and continue dedicating poems to him publicly. Wilde wrote to his friends, urgently forbidding them from allowing it. Even then, he was trying to contain what had already begun to spill into the open, trying to reclaim something that was no longer entirely his. Because once a story becomes public, it stops belonging only to the person who lived it. In 1897, while still imprisoned, Wilde began writing a long letter to Douglas, documenting the last 5 years of their relationship. It wasn't a love letter, it was a reckoning. Not just of their relationship, but of what it meant to live a life that could never be fully public. A reflection shaped by pain, responsibility, and the cost of everything that had happened. The cost of exposure, the cost of being known, in a world that refused to understand what it was seeing. He was never able to send it. Instead, he entrusted it to his friend Robert Ross. Years later, after Wilde's death, Ross published it under the name De Profundis. In it, Wilde writes, "I know that on the day of my release, I will merely be moving from one prison into another. And there are times when the whole world seems to be no larger than my cell." Because for Wilde, the punishment didn't end with imprisonment. It extended beyond it, into reputation, into legacy, into how his story would be told, and retold by others. Once exposed, there was no returning to anonymity, no returning to control. The closet once forced open could never be closed again. By the mid-20th century, secrecy wasn't just personal, it was enforced. What had once existed in fragments, or in code, was now something the government actively sought to uncover. Because the closet had changed. It was no longer just a space people moved within, it had become something to be policed. During the Cold War, the United States became consumed with the fear of hidden threats, most famously, communists. But alongside the Red Scare, another purge was unfolding, one that would last longer, and reach even further into people's lives, the Lavender Scare. Beginning in the late 1940s and continuing into the 1960s, thousands of federal employees were fired, forced to resign, or quietly pushed out, not for what they had done, but for who they were. This wasn't happening in isolation. In the years leading up to it, queer communities had begun to form more visibly in urban spaces. There were gatherings, networks, moments of recognition, similar in some ways to earlier forms of coming out within community. And for a brief moment, there was the possibility of something else. Visibility, connection, maybe even acceptance. Books like Alfred Kinsey's Sexual Behavior in the Human Male brought conversations about same-sex relationships into the public eye, suggesting that these experiences were far more common than many had assumed. But visibility didn't lead to acceptance. It led to fear. Because once something becomes visible, it can also be targeted. By the late 1940s, government programs were already targeting gay men for arrest and intimidation, labeling them as sexual perverts, as criminals, as mentally ill. And then came the rhetoric. Politicians began drawing direct connections between homosexuality and communism, describing both as hidden, subversive, morally corrupt. People who lived secret lives were seen as threats to national security, because if you had something to hide, you could be controlled. In 1953, that fear became policy. President Eisenhower signed Executive Order 10450, which classified sexual perversion as a threat to national security, placing homosexuality alongside criminality, addiction, and dishonesty. And suddenly, the closet wasn't just social, it was under surveillance. Investigations became invasive. Friends, family, coworkers, anyone could be questioned. Even being associated with somebody suspected of being gay could cost you your job. There was no separation between public and private life anymore, and there was no safe way out. Even resignation wasn't protection. Records would permanently mark somebody as homosexual or pervert, following them long after they left their job. An estimated 7,000 to 10,000 federal employees lost their careers during this time. But numbers don't tell the full story, because behind each one was a life that had to be rewritten. Careers ended overnight, reputations destroyed, relationships strained or lost entirely. And in many cases, no opportunity to tell their side of the story. Some names were never recorded, lives reduced to files, identities reduced to accusations. Others were quietly erased, which means for many of them, there is no full story left behind. No letters, no records in their own words, just suspicion and absence. But even those at the highest levels weren't immune. Robert Cutler, a national security advisor to President Eisenhower, a man trusted with some of the country's most sensitive information, resigned at the height of his career fearing exposure. It didn't matter how qualified you were, or how loyal, or how essential, the risk of being known was enough. Because during the Lavender Scare, the closet wasn't just a place people chose to stay. It was a place they were forced into, or punished for leaving. And for the first time, on a massive scale, secrecy wasn't just about survival anymore. It became something to be tracked, investigated, and punished. The closet isn't just a historical reality, it's a psychological one, and living inside it comes at a cost. Not always all at once, but over time, quietly, in ways that aren't always visible from the outside. For many queer people, that process doesn't begin in adulthood, it begins in childhood. As psychiatrist Jack Drescher notes, many gay people grow up surrounded by anti-homosexual attitudes, often within their own families and communities. Messages about what is acceptable, what is normal, what is safe to be, and what isn't. So hiding becomes something learned early, not always consciously, but as a response, a form of protection. And once it's learned, it's hard to unlearn, because it becomes instinct, something automatic, something that happens before you even realize it's happening. That hiding can take many forms. Sometimes it's careful language, speaking about relationships without ever revealing who they're with. Sometimes it's avoidance, deflecting questions, changing subjects, staying just vague enough to remain safe. And sometimes it goes deeper than that, a kind of separation within the self, where certain feelings are pushed down, ignored, or never fully acknowledged at all. A double life, that in some ways doesn't even feel like a life you're allowed to fully know. And over time, that division can deepen. Not just something you do, but something you become used to. You learn which version of yourself belongs in which room. What to say, what not to say, who you can be, depending on who's watching, until the idea of being fully seen starts to feel unfamiliar. Over time, that division can take a toll. It becomes harder to understand how others see you, harder to recognize your own worth, harder to feel like your life, your relationships, your accomplishments, truly belong to you. Because if parts of you are always hidden, it can start to feel like none of it is fully real. The experience has been described as feeling invisible, or voiceless, like being present but never fully seen. Not because you aren't there, but because you've learned how not to be. And even the act of coming out, something often framed as a moment of freedom, isn't simple. It's not just about telling other people. It's about confronting yourself. Putting language to something that may have gone unnamed for years. Reclaiming parts of your identity that were pushed aside just to survive. And learning how to live with them in the open. And even then, it's never without risk. Because being known can mean rejection, loss, disconnection from the very people and places that once defined your life. Writer Armistead Maupin put it bluntly, "My only regret about being gay is that I repressed it for so long. I surrendered my youth to the people I feared." That's the cost of the closet. Not just what's hidden, but what's lost. Time, experience, parts of yourself that never had the chance to fully exist. And for many, silence itself becomes its own kind of harm. Not just something that protects, but something that limits. Something that shapes the boundaries of what feels possible. Audre Lorde, a Black lesbian poet, feminist, and activist, wrote extensively about the dangers of dividing the self in order to survive. She described the pressure to hide as being forced to present only one acceptable piece of yourself, while everything else is pushed aside, fragmented, contained. And she warned that silence doesn't actually protect us. As she wrote, "My silence had not protected me. Your silence will not protect you." Because even in silence, fear remains. She also wrote, "When we speak, we are afraid our words will not be heard or welcomed. But when we are silent, we are still afraid. So it is better to speak." Because the closet promises safety, but it doesn't always deliver it. Instead, it asks for something in return. Your voice, your visibility, sometimes even your sense of self. These patterns don't just live in history. They show up in the stories we tell, and the ones we don't. Because for decades, queer identity in media wasn't spoken outright. It was coded, implied, hidden in subtext. A glance, a pause, a line that says one thing and means another. Because what couldn't be said directly still found a way to exist. You can see that tension clearly in stories where characters are forced to deny what they feel even to themselves. In Brokeback Mountain, two men build a relationship that can only exist in secrecy, shaped as much by silence as by what they feel. There's a moment where one of them says, "You know I ain't queer." And the response comes back, "Me neither." A denial that says more than the truth ever could. Because the truth isn't what's dangerous. Being known is. And sometimes that tension isn't just external, it becomes internal. A question of identity that isn't just about what you feel, but who you're allowed to be. In Moonlight, we see a young man trying to understand himself in a world that doesn't give him the space to do that safely. At one point, he's asked, "Who is you?" It's not just a question, it's a confrontation. About identity, about self-definition, about the pressure to perform one version of yourself while hiding another. But the closet doesn't always look the same. Sometimes it isn't enforced by law, but by expectation. By the roles you're expected to play and the life you're supposed to live. In Gentleman Jack, Ann Lister pushes directly against those expectations, openly pursuing relationships with women in a society that insists she shouldn't exist that way. She says, "Nature played a challenging trick on me, putting a bold spirit like mine in this vessel, while I refused to be cowed by it. A refusal to stay hidden, even when the world demands it." But that freedom isn't universal. In some contexts, the consequences of being known aren't social, they're life-threatening. In Special Ops Lioness, a woman on the verge of an arranged marriage, shaped by religious and societal expectations, speaks about love as something she doesn't have the freedom to choose. She says, "For me to choose love would be the death of me." Not metaphorically, literally. Because in her world, identity isn't just something to navigate. It's something that can determine whether you live or die. And the closet, in that context, isn't about secrecy alone. It's about survival under pressure that never lets up. And sometimes the story isn't about denial or danger, but about something quieter. Something temporary. A love that exists, but only for a moment. In Portrait of a Lady on Fire, two women fall in love in a world that has no space for them to stay together. No future beyond what they can hold onto in memory. There's a line that lingers. Don't regret. Remember. Because sometimes the relationship isn't destroyed. It's simply not allowed to exist. Across genres, across time periods, across cultures, the pattern remains. Desire expressed in fragments, identity shaped by what can't be said out loud, and the constant negotiation between being seen and staying safe. Today, the closet hasn't disappeared. It's just changed form. It doesn't always look like silence anymore, or isolation, but that doesn't mean it's gone. For some, it's shaped by cultural or religious expectations, by traditions that define what a life is supposed to look like, and what happens when you step outside of it. For others, it's shaped by workplace politics, by the calculation of what can be shared and what might quietly cost you opportunities, respect, security. Or by safety, by geography, by the difference between spaces where you can exist openly and the spaces where that same openness could put you at risk. And sometimes the closet isn't external at all. It's internal. A hesitation, a pause before answering a simple question, a moment of calculation. How much of myself is safe to share here? Or by the question of when it's safe to be known and when it isn't. Because that answer isn't fixed. It changes depending on where you are, who you're with, what's at stake. The difference now isn't that the closet is gone. It's that for many, stepping out of it is no longer a single moment, but a decision made over and over again. In every new space, every new job, every new relationship, every assumption that has to be corrected or allowed to stand. Coming out isn't an event, it's a process. A A series of choices, some small, some life-changing, all shaped by the same question: is it safe to be known here? And even in a world that, in many places, is more accepting than before, that question hasn't disappeared. It's just become more complicated. Because the closet was never just about being hidden. It was about navigating a world that made being visible risky, and that hasn't changed completely. It's just changed shape. The closet isn't just a place. It's a pattern. One we've seen across centuries, in fragments of poetry, in coded language, in courtrooms, in government files, in the lives people lived, in the ones they couldn't. And even now, that pattern hasn't fully disappeared. Because the question isn't just why people hid, it's what it cost them to be seen, and what it still costs today. For some, that cost was love. For others, it was safety. For others, everything. A career, a reputation, a future that never got the chance to exist. And even now, that cost hasn't vanished. It's just less visible, more situational, more dependent on where you are, who you're with, and what you're willing to risk. Audre Lorde once wrote, "Nothing I accept about myself can be used against me to diminish me." But acceptance isn't always simple. For so many, it comes after years of silence, years of editing, hiding, dividing, years of learning how to survive before learning how to live. And maybe that's the through line in all of this. Not just secrecy, but what it takes to move beyond it. Because every time a story is told, something shifts. Something becomes visible that wasn't before. And the shape of the closet changes. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the hidden histories of closeted lives. The silence, the resilience, and the cost of living unseen. Unmasked and Unfiltered will release full episodes every other week. Deep dives into the stories, histories, and hidden narratives that shape identity. And in the weeks between, we'll step into Between the Layers. Shorter episodes where we explore books, films, and media that echo these same themes and ask what they reveal about the stories we've just uncovered. Because sometimes the most powerful reflections don't come from history alone, but from the stories we return to. If you found value in today's episode, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with someone who loves uncovering the stories beneath the surface. You can also follow me on Instagram at unmasked_unfiltered pod. I'd love to hear your thoughts, your reflections, or the stories you think deserve to be told next. Next week, we'll step into Between the Layers, with a look at Cantoris by Caro de Robertis and Portrait of a Lady on Fire. 2 stories of love, secrecy, and the kind of freedom that only exists in moments. And in our next full episode, we'll unmask the story of Mata Hari, spy, seductress, or scapegoat, and the myth that turned her into all 3. Until then, remember, behind every mask is a story waiting to be told. So pull up a chair, take off the mask, and I'll see you next time on Unmasked and Unfiltered.